someone says, I'm going to go over to your house to study, draw me a map. You don't just draw lines on a piece of paper. You visualize the road that you would be traveling while you're moving that map down on the paper. And so do the same thing as you practice these. Online on D2L are some what I call tracing pathways. And so as we go through the blood vessels, I'll stop and say, trace a drop of blood from the heart to the little finger on the right side. Or trace a drop of blood from the heart to the stomach. And as we do veins, then it will be trace a drop of blood from the bottom of the little toe back to the heart. So here's this will be on your test item.
Ugh.
The extra credit, you don't want me to say that?
Yes, I do.
The extra credit on this exam will be a tracing question. Trace a drop of blood from somewhere to somewhere. So from means you're going through the veins back to the heart, and then you're going to leave the heart and go somewhere. All right? So there's several practice ones online, and then the answers are on there as well. And we'll do it during class time. I'll put 2 of them up there on the exam, up there. There'll be 2 pages, or 2 lists, and then make your choice. All right, so you can choose one or the other.
Oh, that's nice of you. Thank you.
What I will do is I will write out lines. It won't just be, blank, trace a drop of blood from here to there. I will give you some of the landmarks so you can see, oh, there's an extra line here. I must have missed one. You can get an idea. Am I on the right track? Okay? Also, I ask students to practice by using water-soluble ink and diagram these vessels on yourself. This was a cousin of a student. He didn't do too bad a job.
Rachel, so can you come with us? We're going to need to practice all of
She
these.
was really into detail and labeled everything, not on herself, but via PowerPoint slides.
They drew it on themselves? Or?
Uh-huh.
Oh.
Wow.
More simple effect. With all the shading in.
That's what mine was.
I'm sure she did draw that on the back of her leg. So Bessie, I do think it helps you learn this. I have stopped in the middle of a trail in the Great Smoky Mountains and diagrammed blood vessels. I ran into a student and he was asking me a question, so I got a stick and started drawing. So drawing them on yourself gives you the textural sensation as well as the positioning of where these vessels are.
Can we get extra credit if we do
You
one and take a
you get
picture?
up to 4 points of extra credit.
If we take a picture and turn it in.
Send me a picture if you, I assume unless you say so that I have permission to put it up here. So if you don't want me, you can just show it to me on your phone or something. Or just when you send it to me, say I would prefer this, just delete the picture. So,
I'm gonna take my kids.
I did have a couple years ago, a student did hers on an adult blow-up doll. That was kind of weird. It was a girl. I went to the adult bookstore, video store, and I had that in my office for a few weeks. And this is just weird, so I threw it out. It was all doubled up and stuffed inside a paper sack, and I was just like, I don't know what I'm going to do with this thing.
It's good laying on the ground.
Okay, so just some ideas. Again, the purpose is not to get those extra credit points. The purpose is to learn, practice the material. All right. Eventually, what you should be able to do, let's go get another red pen. What you should be able to do is, when you get your lecture exam, you will have blank pieces of paper available, and draw this out.
Oh my God, the chair's
And you don't even have to label them. All right? Obviously, I've been doing this for over 30 years, so I can do it really fast. But then when I have a question, and it says, the brachiocephalic trunk divides to form which of the following vessels? Okay? Here's the brachiocephalic trunk. It divides to form common carotid and subclavian. You've got that on a piece of paper in front of you. You don't have to pull that file up in your brain every time you see it. Or the celiac, the hepatic artery is a branch of which of the following arteries? Here's the celiac trunk, and it has 3 arteries. So you can kind of see that. So as you practice, again, my students at Sac State are learning muscles right now. They just finished bones, and they're feeling, as usual, overwhelmed because they have half the time to learn them as you guys do. And so I said they only have an hour and a half, hour and 15 minutes of lab twice a week. And so I said, look, whenever you're feeling overwhelmed, back away and take just a small segment. Learn, just look at the muscles of the face rather than trying to look at the, oh my goodness, I have all of these to learn. So today we're just going to do this area and up into the brain. We won't do the upper extremity. We'll do the rest of those tomorrow. And rather than saying, I've got all these vessels, I'm overwhelmed, all right, I'm going to focus on the blood supply to the upper extremity. Or I'm going to do the blood supply in the pelvis or the lower extremity. And isolate out the rest until you understand that thoroughly. And this is easily put back together as packets. Another component is the fact that you've learned the bones. You've learned the nerves. A fibular artery is going to be a lateral vessel, runs along the fibula. Okay? A radial artery, an ulnar artery. A mesenteric artery is going to go through the mesenteria, the peritoneal structures. The hepatic is going to the liver. Renal is going to the kidney. So a lot of those terms, it's not like it's a brand new language. You're already familiar with it. Okay? So let's take a look. We're going to do the blood supply today. See how far we get from the heart to the brain. Now at 4:30 last year, I covered the cerebral circuit, the arterial supply to the brain tissue. Not everybody does that, so I'll go through that again. And then we'll follow the branches of the subclavian artery just out to the clavicle. We're just going to do basically this part of the body during this lab period and then give you some lab time to start studying that. So I'm going to put the heart down low here, so I have room to draw above it. And we're going to follow the aorta and its branches. The aorta is divided into 4 components. So if we look at the previous diagram here, we'll draw these again. We have the ascending aorta, then the arch of the aorta, and then I divide the descending into thoracic and abdominal. So if you're doing a tracing question, there will be lines for both of those. All right? So thoracic aorta stops at the diaphragm, and then abdominal aorta is down to where it splits to form the common iliac arteries. Because it seems to have thrown people off in the past, on these illustrations, there will be vessels here that are named that you don't necessarily have to identify. So just because it's in the picture, like lingual artery or ophthalmic artery, doesn't mean that you have to know it. Okay, I just put a picture in there and didn't go back and delete all the other components. So what I diagram on the board is what you need to know. Okay? So coming out of the left ventricle, we have the ascending aorta. What are the first branches off of the aorta? Wrong. I said that because I knew you guys would fall for it. What have we covered already? What is the first organ to get the vessels from the heart?
Lungs.
From the aorta? Coronary arteries. They come come off they come off really close, but those are the first branches off of the aorta. Dickie, you were right. The brachiocephalic is the first trunk branch off of the trunk, okay? But the coronary arteries down here, well, that's why I said it, because I knew I would get somebody.
Thank you.
I'm making a point. You might see this as a question later. Which of the following are the first arteries to branch off of the aorta? So we have coronary arteries, right and left coronary arteries. Once we're past the heart, you do not have to identify right and left. So we had on our quiz yesterday, you have to say right and left coronary, right atrium, left atrium, right AV valve, and so on, atrioventricular valve. But once we're out in the body, you don't have to say right subclavian or left posterior tibial artery. All right, just naming the vessel is fine. But this is right coronary artery. And a single A is artery, two A's are arteries. All right, and this is the ascending aorta. The first part of the aorta is known as the ascending aorta. Then the aorta bends and goes posterior, slightly to the left, all right, but posterior. We'll draw that over. And then we have the arch of the aorta with the two branches coming off of the arch of the aorta. You can call it arch of the aorta or aortic arch, doesn't matter. And it has three branches. So as you can see, this is looking from the right side on the illustration on the screen. And this is called the brachiocephalic trunk. Brachio referring to upper extremity and cephalic referring to head. And those are the two branches that the brachiocephalic trunk gives off.
What did brachio mean again?
Now, on the left side, in fetal development, there was also a left brachiocephalic trunk. But as the arch developed, it develops more to the left side, and that trunk was resorbed. So it used to look like this, with two brachiocephalic trunks, and then in fetal development, eventually the common and carotid and left subclavian come directly off of the aorta while the right brachiocephalic trunk remains. Okay. When we get to the venous system, we will have two brachiocephalic trunks for the venous system. The brachiocephalic trunk is 5. Call it brachiocephalic artery if you wish. Trunk is a common name for that. And then it will divide into two branches, as I said, one going up to the head and one going over to the right arm. The right common carotid artery is a branch of the brachiocephalic trunk. And the left common carotid artery comes directly off of the aortic arch. I think it's like number 25 or something, so I'll just write the name down here beside it. And then the other branches subclavian will come back to that. And then the left subclavian comes off of the aortic arch as well.
Question,
Uh-huh.
how do you distinguish between the right and the left common carotid?
Oh, do you?
Yeah.
Can we just put a 6 on both of them?
Yeah. I'm not sure what your question
Like
is.
if something's wrong with the one on the
Right
right,
and left, common cross.
how would you know that the doctor's talking about that side and not that side?
Oh. Oh, they would have to, if you're doing surgery, you certainly want to know what's the right side or the left side.
Right.
Okay.
You just left or right.
Yeah, I'm just saying I'm not going to mark you off or not, because
Oh.
some of our limbs, you don't know whether it's a right or left model. You're not looking at the entire structure. All right, so let's follow the common carotid arteries up into the neck. So here is the common carotid. And about the level of the jaw, the voice box, is going to divide. And it's going to form the external carotid. Anytime we have common carotids and common iliacs, we have branches that are external and internal. Okay? So there's an external carotid artery that supplies the outside the skull, back of the skull, anterior neck, face, inside the jaw. And then the internal carotid obviously is going to go to the brain. So I'm just going to keep drawing here on the right side. So we have the external carotid branch, and internal carotid branch is going to go up to and pass through carotid canal. And this would be internal carotid artery, which is 8.
Okay, so, bless you. So 6 goes up like this.
Or 7?
The other
7
carotid-
is external.
The other carotid. Or you change it.
Okay, so let's look at the external carotid artery. And you can see some of these branches on our head model. You can't see internal because it's covered up by muscle and by the jawbone. You can see them on the skulls that are over on the cabinet there. But here is occipital artery going along the back of the scalp, at the back of the head. And facial artery, which goes towards the nose. And finally, the external carotid ends as the superficial temporal up here on the scalp. Again, all of those are outside the skull. All right. So in addition to our face model, you can also see these vessels on the skull model. So here is the common carotid artery traveling up the side of the neck here. It's going to divide to form the external carotid right here, and the internal carotid is going to go up into the skull. And these tops come off and you can look at their branches inside. Here we have the facial artery crossing across the face. Deep inside will be the maxillary artery. And then again, you can see superficial temporal up here. All right, so I'm going to diagram those on the board. So I'm going to add occipital here. It's not on that list, so I'm just going to write it in. It goes to the occipital bone, so it should be too difficult to
So
identify.
that's coming off the internal,
That's coming off on
the
7.
internal or
It would be
external?
coming off of 7, yes.
Oh, external.
And then we have, coming to the anterior neck, we have the superior thyroid. That's 8. So it comes down, it supplies the voice box as well as the thyroid gland. it gives off a really squirrely one that goes across the jawline. From here to here. In fact, you can feel this if you feel for the edge of your masseter muscle. There's a slight depression. And if you put 2 fingers there, you can feel the facial pulse. We'll be feeling for pulses next week on Thursday.
Oh, I can.
And that's one of the ones that you can find because it crosses right over the mandible at that location, right here.
Oh, that's crazy.
You're still alive, I hope, though. So that would be facial artery.
Okay, so we have 7, 8.
And then there's a branch that goes behind the mandible. It's going to supply your chewing muscles. So between your mandible and like the pterygoid and so on. So even though it's going behind the mandible, it's identified as the maxillary artery. And on this one, it's kind of hard to see, but it's this one right here. Do you guys recall the opening in the sphenoid bone, just posterior and slightly lateral to the foramen ovale? No. So we have foramen rotundum, foramen ovale, and there's a tiny little, almost like an exclamation foramen spinosum. Okay? This vessel right here passes up through the foramen spinosum and along the inside of the skull, supplying the meninges. So if you break that thin portion of the temporal bone, this artery gets torn and can lead to bleeding under the skull and increased intracranial pressure. You can see it if you open up the top of those skulls and look inside. It forms grooves along the inside of the skull, so it's not supplying brain. It's supplying the skull and the meninges, the dura mater, and so on. And so this is identified as the middle meningeal artery. And it passes through the foramen spinosum to get inside the skull. And then finally, the terminal branch, the last component of the external carotid artery, are several branches all identified as the superficial temporal. There is a deep temporal, but you don't have to know it. I think that's 13. All right, so we have a part.
This all comes off the external.
Yes, that's what I was about to say. We have the external carotid artery. All right, so here's the external carotid artery. And then these are all branches of the external carotid artery.
Sounds like a lecture question.
You know me too well. Or enough. So again, that's outside the skull. These are not going to the brain. Even the middle meningeal artery is not going to the brain. Internal carotid artery passes through the carotid canal and supplies the brain. In addition, coming off of the subclavian, traveling up, farther than I'm going to draw because it makes it look too complicated, we have the vertebral artery.
Okay, so what else we have?
And then 15 will be the vertebral artery.
Oh, you're down here.
And again, remember that's the vertebral artery are named because they travel through the transverse foramina of the cervical vertebra. So running right here through the cervical vertebra, you can see the vertebral arteries. And they enter into the skull to travel with the brainstem. What opening do they use to travel through the skull?
Everyone wants to be a star.
Everyone is a star.
Yeah.
So here you can see the vertebral artery passing up through the cervical vertebra, and they finally enter into the skull via the foramen magnum, along with the spinal cord brainstem. So I'm not going to draw that here because my foramen magnum would be huge. But we're now going to look at, we have two pairs of vessels that supply blood to the brain, oxygenated blood to the brain. We have two vertebral arteries and two internal carotid arteries, and that's it. 4 vessels going into the skull to supply oxygenated blood to the brain. Remember in the heart, I told you the vessels do not anastomose. So if one major vessel is blocked, the tissue supplied by that is dead. In the brain, we do have an anastomosis. So you can have almost all of both of the carotid arteries blocked, and blood, if it's outside the brain in the neck, and blood can come up the vertebral arteries and go out the branches of the carotid and still supply blood to the brain. We get a block in one of these, and you're going to suffer some problems. Okay? Yes?
Could you say again the 4 vessels that go into
2 vertebral arteries and 2 internal carotid arteries. All right, I want to keep this diagram on the board, erase my terms, and diagram the cerebral circuit. I'll come back to this image. On our, in lab, we'll kind of look at the cadavers, not this week, but if we have time next week.